Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen McFarlane, Global Head of Revenue at Pigment. And today I'm pleased to be joined on Portraits by Gurneet Kaur, go-to-market finance and strategy leader at Block. Block is one of the most ambitious fintech companies today. It's a collection of businesses from Square to Cash App, all growing fast and all connected by a single foundational team that Gurneet is a part of. Her job is to make sure that as Block scales, the systems and the processes underneath it scale with it. Gurneet, I've heard you speak before about three principles that seem to guide and drive the work that you do. You mentioned first, connecting the blocks, second, giving time back, and third, enabling agility. I'd love to start by just digging deeper into these three themes, beginning with connecting the dots. Block is a fascinating company. It's simultaneously one company and many businesses all at the same time. I imagine that creates an interesting amount of tension to your role because you have to serve businesses that are genuinely different while also creating the conditions for each one of them to work together. How do you do that?
That's a lovely question, and thank you for having me. I would say, Block is certainly unique in that we operate so many different businesses, but at the core of it, we are truly connected by our common purpose, which for us has always been economic empowerment, right? We want to help more people, more businesses participate in our economy, be it through Square serving our local sellers, or Cash App serving consumers, or even Afterpay, which sits quite at the intersection of commerce and financial services. So I love that common mission that as a company we're all guided by, but it still remains. We operate different businesses, and we don't want to force every business into the same playbook, right? We want them to operate independently, but what we don't want is them operating in isolation. So over the years, I think, Block has increasingly embraced a functionalized operating model. So I sit in the foundation team, but if I'm connected with marketing, Square, Cash, Afterpay, they all work together. And we create these common forums where we are constantly thinking, how do we identify capabilities that we can build once, and then we can scale and leverage that all across our ecosystem? So if I'm working with marketing, I'm constantly thinking, how do we work through common planning frameworks? Or how do I create a common pipeline that can be served by all businesses? Or it could even be a common planning rhythm. But again, it's really trying to strike that balance between giving them autonomy to work fast in their own business contexts, but also aligning on the fundamentals. So yeah, I think it's just about not operating in silos, and that's where my job comes in.
Okay, I love hearing about a purpose-driven organization. I think it makes a lot of sense in terms of the scale with which Block operates. What does it actually take in order to get different teams in a complex organization speaking the same language then? Is that primarily a technology challenge? Is it a process challenge? Is it a people challenge?
I think it's a layered challenge that frankly combines all of those elements. But if I were to sequence it, I would start with people, right? Like the first question often isn't what tool are we using? It's do we align on what we are measuring and why we are measuring it? If there are two teams looking at the same term and they are interpreting it differently, I think the idea of that like value that we want from a language is lost. So I do think we need to have alignment on our key objectives and metrics. And once you do have that alignment, I think the next layer to it would be your data and your processes. The data is something that's a trusted foundation that you need to create so that your different definitions that you have aligned on, they are actionable. And then processes to me is where the real work happens. You think about a consistent planning rhythm. You think about driving clear ownership on different parts of the process. And that's where you start to bring that common language. But at the top of it, I think, sits technology. To me, it's like the glue that makes everything click. If you have the right technology, the shared language that you have created, you are able to reinforce it over time and bring that visibility across the org.
As you think about technology, one of the second core principle you've talked about is kind of giving time back. You mentioned, earlier about how you build once, but something is highly utilized across the organization. Can you give us an example of any high value work that your teams are able to do now that they weren't able to do before?
A recent example I could talk about is our launch of sales compensation and quota model in Pigment this quarter. Historically or pre-Pigment, compensation was something that was largely communicated to our sales reps periodically, like end of month, end of quarter when pay is due. But throughout that commissionable period, like our reps would often come to our comp operations team asking questions about where their numbers stand, what the drivers are, and they didn't have that sort of clarity going in. So our ops time spent a significant amount of time just answering these questions. And I felt like it was highly manual and difficult to scale. With Pigment, what we have been able to achieve is we have been able to create a very transparent and self-serve capability to our reps. Now, our reps can log into Pigment, and at any given point in time, they can look at their performance, their live attainment, how are they tracking towards it. We have even released what if calculators for them to estimate their commissions. So to me, that's saving time in a sense that our ops team now can spend more time sitting with our business partners, really thinking about the questions like how are we driving performance? How are we incentivizing the right behaviors? Or is there something we can do in terms of sales motions as the business evolves? So to me, I think that's the most exciting part about these transformations, where we are not just thinking about automation, but creating space for our people to just participate in high value work.
As you think about that transition, what's been your observation? Do you feel that people naturally make the shift from operational work to strategic work? Or is it the role of leaders really in this new world to kind of actively help their teams evolve those skills and kind of the skill sets that they need?
I do think that the shift doesn't happen automatically. Like when I think about it, like giving time back is necessary, but it's only the first step. Yeah. Strategic work is often something that develops with like a different set of muscles over time. So when I think about leaders, I think they have to be quite intentional in bringing their team into the fold on different kind of conversations. So they have to create opportunities for their team to participate in more decision-making conversations, encourage them to challenge assumptions. So if I was going to ask someone on the team to produce a forecast, I would probably start by asking them, what is the forecast telling us? If someone's producing a variance analysis report for me, I would start by digging more and saying, what's the variance telling us and what actions can we take on it? So to me, these are like small changes, but they do build a very different set of muscles that help you become more strategic over time.
I'd love to just follow up because you mentioned intentionality. I'm sure there's been intentionality even personally for yourself. How have you personally seen your own role and skill set and perhaps even mindset shift?
It's really evolved over time, I would say. Earlier in my career, I would say it was a lot about being the person with the answer, being the problem solver in the room. But today I find myself increasingly in spaces where I'm often creating alignment around decision making. You know, I'm always connecting dots across teams, aligning my stakeholders around a common objective, just navigating more and more ambiguity. So the technical skills still remain very important in my role, but I do think the value really comes from being able to influence, to communicate clearly, and just to navigate ambiguity in these circumstances. So that's kind of been a shift in my nature of work.
I like the way you've thought through it. Alignment versus answer as you've kind of gone through that shift. And you mentioned like it's essentially an evolution, which ties into the third core principle that you've talked about before, Gurneet, agility. And I think it's a word that is everywhere right now, but it often means very different things to different people. In your experience, what does it mean to be part of an agile business or an agile function within a number of businesses like you have at Block? And what needs to be in place in order to get there and achieve that?
Yeah, I do agree that agility probably often gets confused with speed. In my mind, when I say an agile business, what I'm truly thinking is adaptability, right? Change is bound to happen. Reality will always diverge from a plan that you made. But it's truly about organizations who are ready to identify that change, understand the implications, and then respond confidently to it, right? And so I do think agility in that sense is a function of your confidence. And that stems from a couple of things, I would say. First, you need to have visibility into what's happening. And that comes from the right information being presented to you. If you're operating on data that's months or even weeks or days old, you're already operating on the back foot. So I think that visibility is really important. The second part to it would be alignment, which comes back to the people, right? if you have the right data, you need to make sure that the people are aligned on that common objectives of what success looks like for you. And I think lastly, it's about trust. Often today we are dealing with so much information, but at some point it's still sometimes incomplete or incorrect. So as leaders, you need to be able to operate and make decisions sometimes with incomplete information. If every decision required multiple layers of validation and consensus, as an organization, you might become slow and you will not be able to react quickly and confidently. So I do think that that trust is super important as well.
As visibility increases, to your point, as trust kind of becomes more part of the stronger narrative right now within organizations, especially in this new world, do you think the purpose of planning itself is changing? And maybe to add to that, is it less about working towards this single future? And is it now more about almost preparing for multiple possible futures? How do you reconcile those?
I absolutely agree with it. Like the role of planning in my mind is certainly evolving today. We are increasingly operating in an environment where markets are shifting, our customer behavior is changing, new technologies around us are emerging. In that sense, I think the goal of plan to create a most accurate forecast, that's no longer the case, right? We are constantly dealing with multiple outcomes that are possible, and we have to evaluate those in terms of scenarios. Think about different assumptions of where we are driving our business. So to me, I think planning has become less about prediction and much more about preparedness, right? Like, how are you preparing your organization to deal with uncertainty, not necessarily eliminate it?
If you were to essentially try to pull that into your experience at Block today, I think Block's an incredible, organization to look at from a case study perspective in terms of the growth and the rapid growth. It's just evolved and grown so quickly. One thing that always strikes me with these high growth organizations is that yesterday's strengths can certainly become tomorrow's constraints. How are you also thinking through that? The processes that certainly helped to get, Block to where it is today, maybe to one stage aren't going to get you to the next stage of the company's development and growth. When it comes to planning processes and infrastructure, how did you know that you had reached your limit with respect to what you had in-house at the given time with the existing tools or the people or the technology or the processes that you had? Was there a specific breaking point? Walk us through that journey.
Sure. I wouldn't necessarily call it a breaking point. Things were working. And I think the tools that we had at a point in time that got us here were probably right for that period. But I think it was an increasing acknowledgement from all our teams that the complexity that we are dealing with is really outpacing our infrastructure. It was the acknowledgement from our teams that we are neither getting the scale or the depth that we need from spreadsheets. So when our business starts asking us questions, faster than our planning processes can answer them, everyone kind of took a step back and realized, okay, our planning infrastructure needs to be given a thought. And I think so that's really what brought the discussions of, are we ready to embrace a new tool? And in order for that to happen, we really had to take a deep look at our data and our processes. And once that was in place, we started to give a hard look at the technology itself. So I think those, like that for me is more of an inflection point, that saying that our business has evolved and our planning infrastructure just needs to evolve with it.
I think the way you've put it is probably, top of mind for a lot of, certainly technology leaders and finance technology leaders when the innovation certainly starts to outpace the current state. As you went through that same journey at Block and you were evaluating different options, give us insight into what were maybe some of the top 2 or 3 things that you were looking for and evaluating for.
Yeah, I think the biggest one would be scalability for us. Block has increasingly, as I mentioned, embraced a functional operating model. So we have been giving a very close thought on how are we consolidating our platforms and making the most of it. So for us, when we started evaluating a planning tool, we started with the use case of marketing. But at the time, the thought wasn't just limited to marketing as a function. From the beginning, it was, how do we find a solution that can scale for multiple use cases with time? So for us, it was not about like a point solution, but really bringing all of our teams together to to operate in the same platform. So scalability, I would say, was really key for us. The second one would be flexibility. We were looking for a platform that was elastic, that was flexible to change with our changing needs. Our business is constantly shifting, our priorities are changing, our leaders are asking different set of questions each day. And we want to make sure that every time our business priorities change, we do not have to start from scratch. And we are really able to make the same platform work with the change that's happening. So I think that was the second one. And overall, I think we were really focused on bringing a platform to Block that was AI first. And when I'd say AI first, a lot of platforms, they are embedding AI features on top of what exists. But for us, what really mattered is if we could see the vision of the vendor of how are they going to bring AI and dictate the future of planning through AI. For us, that was really important that AI is not an afterthought, but it's truly embedded in the design. So increasingly in our conversations, we talked a lot about what are the agents, what are the assistants, and that really helped in our evaluation.
Okay, so just to echo it back, scalability, flexibility, AI first, and change is kind of the operating word that you kind of mentioned with all three. I think we all agree so much is changing, certainly within the landscape today with, the advancements in AI, certainly, kind of the third, critical thing you were looking for. In terms of how businesses operate today, and certainly, and what Block itself is even becoming, which is just this changing organization that seems to evolve, every month. It can feel hard to know, just take it from a planning perspective, where we'll be in the long term. How do you balance that of choosing a technology decision today for where the business might have to look out for planning in the long term? How did you give that thought?
Yeah, these are interesting times. Previously we would evaluate technology by like a well-defined set of needs that we had at a point in time. But now we are increasingly thinking about how do we take a vendor and partner with a vendor that's going to adapt over time and evolve alongside our business. So that's really the thought process behind our evaluations at Block. Um, and we thought about it in multiple layers, right? We had in-depth conversations with the Pigment team on what the roadmap looks like. It's not about what the product is today when we are adopting it, but give us a sneak peek into your roadmap. What kind of agents and assistants are you thinking about? At the time that we picked Pigment, we did not have a lot of idea of what was going to be unfolding in terms of so many agents that we have at our disposal, but we got a sneak peek into it. So I think that was really valuable, bringing that roadmap into our discussions. That gave our team a lot of clarity and confidence that we were looking for the platform, it might meet our needs. The second thing I would say was the architecture itself. Our teams went pretty deep on the hard conversations, right? Like, okay, what are the data volumes that the platform can really manage? What about the interoperability of the platform? Like, does it fit well in our tech stack? Any performance considerations that we should be aware of? So we really digged deep into all of those aspects. And in all of them, Pigment really met the bar of what we were looking at. So it really helped to go deep in the architecture. The other big piece of it would be Pigment's design philosophy that really stuck out to our teams. We are hearing so much in the market about Pigment having intuitive UX, and that really mattered. We started with marketing, and they were really focused on how are they going to interact with and what will be the user experience. But in terms of design philosophy, our technical team was also thinking, is it going to be something that can be increasingly made accessible to our business partners? And it shouldn't be we don't want to create gatekeepers with any planning tool. So it shouldn't be only with specialists to own. So it really mattered to us that business can co-own this and really make it work for themselves. So that was big. And I would say the last but not the least is the people factor for us. From the very first conversation, the very first demo that Pigment gave us, it did not feel generic in any sense. It felt tailored, it felt specific, and it felt like Pigment had done their homework on what exactly we needed. So that kind of care coming in before you're even a customer, I think that sets the tone for the partnership. So that really sealed the deal for us.
I'd love to sit on that for a minute because I think it's interesting. You mentioned that you started with marketing. It's obviously expanded into sales and most recently into finance. At what point did you realize that Pigment wasn't just a tool for one business unit, for one specific use case, but could become a core part of how Block as an organization operates?
I think that vision was there from the very beginning, the very first evaluation that we did, because scalability, as I mentioned, was the key criteria for choosing a platform. So even when we started with marketing, that was a meaningful use case at the time to begin with. But our vision was broader than one function and one department. We were thinking, if this first launch succeeds, it gives value, how do we operate and how do we scale it across Block? So I think that vision was there, but it was truly a matter of setting that roadmap. And once Pigment launched for marketing, it was so easy for other teams. Our marketing finance users were using the tool, and word spread that, hey, why don't we plug the rest of finance on it? Sales reached out saying, hey, we have this compensation and quota model that needs to be automated across Block. So I think it was a very natural conversation that evolved. So it was a matter of time before it would scale. And confidence came along the way with each execution.
Could we just pull the curtain back maybe a little bit? I think it'd be helpful for so many as you think about, change management in finance can be particularly challenging. The stakes feel really high. You're dealing with the most critical and sensitive data, especially for, organizations that are rapidly evolving. The habits certainly run deep in terms of, the technology usage and the usage patterns. How did you win over the skeptics as you kind of went through this transformation organizationally? Anything you kind of share with us of how do you transform and mitigate from the status quo?
Interestingly, at Block, it was a bit different from a traditional change management story that I experienced, because at Block, people were actively seeking change. It wasn't a lot about resistance. In fact, I saw a lot of demand from people saying that, hey, our infrastructure is needs to keep up with the complexity. So I think when we started with the marketing use case, there was demand coming in. But of course, it was our vision to scale it. And we wouldn't really know about it until the first launch happens. So I would say the change was very much necessary for us. Our discussions were mostly around, hey, change is needed, but how do we find the right solution? So we spent a lot of time in our evaluations to figure out the right solution. And then I think, typically in terms of change management, I wouldn't underestimate or underscore the fact that people need confidence that if you're bringing in a tool, you are reimagining their process. It needs to add value to their day to day work. It needs to meaningfully improve what they are doing. And I think that happened with the initial launch. We launched marketing, and we already started giving time back to our marketing planners through different cycles. So, really, in their conversations with the other stakeholders, I could walk into rooms and be like, hey, this is Pigment that we are adopting for marketing. And there was curiosity in the room. And people started to say that this is working well for this stakeholder. Why don't we think about it? So I think it just was execution that really carried us along. Um, but I like that there was appetite for change for sure.
It sounds like that's an organizational philosophy. As you mentioned, you have a number that are actively seeking change, which is probably fairly unique. How has AI changed the way that your teams operate at scale? How do you think that's going to evolve over time at Block?
AI has been embedded at Block and in the ways we work from the very early days. Like there has been increasing thought on experimentation, on adoption across the company, not even specific to engineering. It's like it's embedded in every function. And how it's working out for like in my team, the way I see it is really the function of giving back time and where we spend that time. It's been really evident in our productivity and in our speed. A lot of time previously that my team spent on was manually reconciling numbers, answering individual inquiries, and really spending a lot of time on those tasks. But now with the time that we are getting by, putting AI to work and automating some of our daily tasks, we are just able to serve more broadly. We are able to scale and really spend more time in the room with our business partners. So that is the value that we are really getting at this point in time. And I would say, how it's evolving maybe it's AI today is more of an assistant that does a task that you give it. But I do think it will increasingly become more embedded in our workflows, where it's just working in the background. If I think of planning, scenarios that we run today can be run by AI. And maybe we'll just get a report one day and say, like, hey, these are the highlights, these are the trends. What do you want to do about it? So that's where we will increasingly start to spend more of our time.
I think Block's unique in the way you describe it, because obviously AI is embedded in every function. It's certainly been top of mind since the very beginning. maybe help organizations that might not be as far along in that journey as Block is. What needs to be true within an organization before AI can actually improve planning and decision making at scale?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like when people think of AI, it's like how sophisticated is a model, but truly at the core, it needs to operate it on trusted data, right? Like that's the core of it. Often I'm in conversations with teams, and the first thing that they'll ask me is like, okay, what data are we syncing with this, right? Like, is it consistent? What's your source of truth? So those are the questions that I'm asked often. If people do not trust the data going in, they probably wouldn't trust the insights that they are receiving from it, right? So I think the data piece has to be really addressed. And the second thing for that to add on to would be your process alignment, your process clarity. You know, if AI sits on top of a ambiguous process, it's only going to amplify that, and you don't want that. So you need to define clear ownership for your process. What is that process truly driving in terms of success? You need to drive that and make sure that people are very clear about what their day-to-day looks like if they're operating in AI. And lastly, I think, it can't be emphasized enough that it's really about the culture, like bringing people along, giving them avenues to experiment, to challenge assumptions. AI will increasingly giving you like a lot of insights. But is your organization structured to receive that insight, to debate it, to act on it? I think that's really important. And that just comes with exposure, with experimentation.
I want to go back to the first part of your answer. I think it gets to the fundamental question of trust. And you've mentioned this a number of times. There's a real question right now in the market about where AI supports decisions and where it starts making them. How are you thinking through essentially this trade-off right now? What would make you feel comfortable letting AI take the lead, for example, in kind of supporting some of these decisions? Or where do you always want a human in the loop? How are you thinking through that?
I think I always think about it as like, what is each of them uniquely like good at? When I think of AI, it's like AI is so good at processing large amounts of information, surfacing risks, trends, right? So if I think the more repetitive, data intensive, and rules based the task is, the more comfortable I would be letting AI take the lead. Where it gets interesting is if there's trade offs and high stakes, more ambiguity that you're operating in, something that requires like the nuance of your business context. The higher the stakes, the higher the consequences. I would say, let's take a step back. We need a human in the loop here. We need the decision maker here. So that's how I would think about it. It's like AI can help us answer this question of what's happening. And it's the human in the loop that's saying, okay, what should we do about it? So that's kind of the way to think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, I like the thought process, right? The higher the stakes, the higher the consequences. And I think the way you're articulating it, Gurneet, is like play to the strengths, right? Either of AI or the human in the loop, et cetera. I'd love to, let's get personal for a second. Like, how are you thinking about this for yourself in your own role? Like, how are you personally keeping up with the pace of change right now? You have, obviously this kind of embarkment of AI in the journey of strategic finance. You think about new tools, new ways of working. Maybe just unlock a little bit for us. What does your own learning actually look like?
We are dealing with so much information overload that it's like hard to be on top of every single tool and every agent that gets released. But for me, it's like those small changes that I make in my day-to-day routine. And for me, learning has always been about being hands-on, like try the tool yourself. So I often find myself experimenting. We have so many tools available at Block to explore with. Sometimes I'll be like connecting Pigment with Claude and getting a lot of my insights. We have our internal tool, which is Goose. I find myself putting a lot of our project documentation, just feeding it to Goose and saying, give me the summary. I'm in 10 meetings. I need to do a lot of context switching. Give me a summary before I step into this meeting and just let me take the lead on what's the next steps that I should be addressing. So I think just experimenting with AI in that matter has been really helpful for me. I'm spending a lot of time with Modeler Agent now. There are so many models that we are developing and we are maintaining as well that it's really giving me a very good starting point to go insert myself into the model and say, okay, this change needs to be made. The business asked for it. How do we help make that happen? And I have found myself like talking to it a lot, working in iterations and making it work, So that's been really interesting. And also I would say it's about just working with my people and the team and learning from them. It's sometimes when I'm in a conversation with my colleague and they have explored a use case that I hadn't even thought of. To me, it's like, okay, let me go try that now. And it's just going back to your basics, staying curious. For me, it's like I'm comfortable being a beginner in this and just saying, let's ask the hard questions and figure it out together. So it's been an interesting journey and we are still exploring.
It's great to hear. It sounds obviously like a culture of learning is key for you and your teams. It's clear you're a hands-on learner, and that's been important for you and for the team as well. Maybe perhaps like what's a leadership skill that, as you think about the transformation that's taking place, even within the function that you're a part of today, where it's becoming more cross-functional, it's becoming more strategic in nature. Any leadership skills that you've had to essentially develop as this change has taken place?
For sure. As I said, my role has certainly evolved over time. And one of the skills that I think I've had to develop is just being able to create alignment around me and helping people make decisions, sometimes without authority or ownership, right? I'm working with so many teams who have different competing priorities, and there are so many decisions that sit at the intersection of all of these conversations. So for me, the skill I've had to develop is, okay, how do I connect these different perspectives of the stakeholders I'm engaging with? How do I create clarity and then help people make decisions and align on it? And when I say alignment, it's not always that everyone agrees on everything. It's more about, can everyone understand the why behind a decision and just commit themselves to moving forward together as a team? So in my role, that's become increasingly valuable, where I don't have to always be the person with the answer, but if I can get that alignment around me, that's value.
So that's obviously taking shape in the short term, which I think you have a great structure for the way you're thinking through it. What about longer term? What are you paying attention to right now? And maybe step outside of your role, look at it from just a finance leadership perspective and a go-to-market leadership perspective that's really shaping how you think about the next number of years. Anything in particular you draw our attention to?
The top of mind for me right now is what's our operating model? What's our team structure looking like? And that's because AI has like increasing, like it has lowered barriers to knowledge in ways we haven't thought of before. Like what required specialists, like specific skills to engage with and get information. If you have the right prompt, if you have the right questions for AI, you're getting those answers. So in a world where we have those barriers which are no longer there and people have so much access to knowledge, I'm constantly paying attention to, okay, how is that going to change our team structure, be it in my team or across the org that I deal with? How do we think about our talent model? How do we think as leads? How do we grow the human potential alongside AI? So to me, it's not just the technology, but the human equivalent of it. Like,
Mhm.
how are we evolving alongside AI in the next few years? So that's just fascinating. These are interesting times.
Well said. Gurneet, I want to thank you so much for joining us on Portraits today. It's been a fascinating conversation. I think a number of lessons that so many of our listeners are going to be able to take away and certainly put into practice. Thank you again for the time that you share with us today.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me.